Why is Google dropping $1 billion in Australia?
And why is Apple finally offering consumers self-service repair parts?
And why on earth is Telstra getting into the electricity market?
And, I promise we'll stop soon, as Xbox hits 20, what difference did Microsoft make to the gaming market?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hey there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and due to an abandoned international rights deal with Netflix, I'm still joined by Alex Kidman. Alex, Paramount Plus has stolen Star Trek Discovery back from Netflix at the very last minute, and we won't see it till next year, damn it. Is it time to fire up the Vertical Hold bird of prey and wreak vengeance?
Oh, crap. I thought you actually knew, Adam. The vertical hold bird of prey was nestling on that Russian satellite that got blown up earlier in the week.
No!
But the good news here, I was able to save most of the cloaking mechanism and trade it in. So we now have the vertical hold Mr. Squiggles rocket. That's the same thing, right?
Close enough. Close enough. We might have to get, I think, Steve Malk back on the show soon to rant about this and what it all means for international rights deals. But speaking of a good rant, we're joined again this week in the virtual Vertical Hold studios by ZDNet's Chris Duckett. Chris, welcome back to the show.
Always good to be here, gents.
Are you a Star Trek man? Have you been burned by this decision?
Have I been burned by Paramount Plus? You mean the former company that owned me? That one.
Oh, the wounds go deep. The wounds go deep there. We better move on. So Chris is joining us to talk about, his personal grievances that he needs to deal with in therapy. And also, Telstra is taking on the energy giants. Google's dropping a cool $1 billion on research and development in Australia. And Labor has its own new plan for the NBN. Now, ordinarily, that'd be more than enough for a show, but this week is a super packed effort because Apple decided to announce self-service repair options coming soon to an iPhone near you. We'll chat to Choice's Aaron Turner about what all that means for Aussie consumers.
But first, Microsoft celebrated 20 years of Xbox earlier this week with a not-so-surprising fast launch of Halo Infinite multiplayer and a few other key surprises. I caught up with Matt Sainsbury from digitallydownloaded.net to chat all things Xbox. Matt, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be here as always. Thank you for the invite.
So, it's 20 years since Microsoft first launched the first Xbox, and looking back at that time, they've certainly come a long way, but that first machine was a bit of a weird step for Microsoft, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't think anybody expected it. I mean, when they announced it, I think there was a lot of people that were quite surprised by it. And right up to the release of the console, people were wondering what role would Microsoft actually have in the game space, because it had become very much dominated by Sony and Nintendo. And it seemed like it was just that big corporate trying to push into a space that they kind of didn't really belong in, Microsoft being an enterprise software company by and large. And it was an interesting one. I certainly was very skeptical of it when I first played around with it, and it's just testament, I guess, to them that they've actually managed to not only carve out a big space of the industry, but in so many ways kind of lead it from there.
Yeah, because we'd seen some big brands try the kind of console thing. Apple had the Pippin, you had things like the 3DO, and even sort of the CDI. All these companies throwing a lot of money at console gaming and crashing and burning. And Microsoft had sort of been involved with Dreamcast because that's a Windows CE machine. But this was sort of a PC in a box, and that was one of those kind of early criticisms of that original Xbox.
Well, I mean, the other thing is to remember Microsoft was an American company, and the last American game console that had any kind of impact was Atari, and we all know how that went. So, yeah, I think people that were growing up or had grown up on Japanese companies creating Japanese hardware, and it was a very Japanese-dominated space, the video game kind of console industry. For Microsoft to break into that with a device that was aesthetically very different to the consoles that the Japanese companies were creating, and coming from a space where people thought Microsoft was Word and those horribly ugly Excels. It was just interesting. People were just fascinated, I guess, about how it was going to go and very skeptical.
Yeah, actually, the Japan link is an interesting one. And I think it's one that's been a bit overlooked this week because Microsoft spent a lot of money. They threw a hell of a lot of money at the original Xbox. And especially in Japan, trying to get Japanese developers on board. They did not have a lot of success in Japan, though, did they?
No, and it's been interesting to see that as well. Like for both the original Xbox and the 360, Microsoft was very heavily invested in trying to push into the Japanese market. They basically gave up, I think, with the Xbox One. And it does seem like they're trying to push back in again with this new one. But again, it seems to be a very difficult space for them. What they've done very well is pivot towards, I guess, attracting the international, the global consumer. And they've done a better job, I think, than anybody in tapping into the all important American market. Like they obviously being an American company, I think they understand it better than anybody else. So that's always been their traditional strength, and they've done a very good job in continuing to serve that market first and foremost.
The one thing we did get out of the Japanese launch was that smaller controller. Were you a
Mm.
fan of the big Goliath, what is it, the Duke controller on the OG Xbox? Because I'll put my hand up and say I was not.
Yeah, I don't know. I barely remember holding that thing other than it was very clunky and unwieldy, and it was not a fun experience at all. I've always been a Sony boy as far as controllers are concerned. I've always found that DualShock just a very comfortably fitting controller, and the fact that they haven't messed with that too much has made sense to me from that basis. The Xbox, I don't know. I think later editions, the more recent models have done a good job, but yeah, that first one was a clumsy thing to deal with.
Yeah, the OG Xbox to me, I think, was that kind of clumsy first step, and I think even Microsoft recognized this when they shifted through to the 360 because the original Xbox, especially here in Australia, was very big. Like it did very well for
Mm.
them here, but they really dropped it pretty fast in favor of the 360, which was really where they picked up, as you say, that global market and a lot of that steam, a lot of the stuff that people remember of Xbox. But sticking with the OG one just for a minute more, what games did you favour on that machine? What
Well,
really ate up your gaming time?
it was definitely a chance to play games that were kind of PC experiences that I really never had a gaming PC until very recently. I've always been a console player. So to have a console that was really focused on giving me those PC experiences, like Morrowind in particular, I spent a lot of time playing Morrowind on the Xbox, and really that was where I fell in love with the Elder Scrolls series. And then there was also this series that came out of Korea, of all places, called Kingdom Under Fire, and it was this mesh up of a Dynasty Warrior style action and real time strategy. So as you know from our conversations, that kind of very much speaks to the kind of gamer I am today. But I think that was one of the first experiences that I had of that kind of mashup of action. And it was kind of ahead of its time.
So Microsoft forces itself into the games market by spending literally billions of dollars.
Still do.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they've also put, I would argue, you might have a different viewpoint, they've also pushed forward a whole bunch of interesting experiments and models and ways to game, some of them more successful than others. I mean, things like the Kinect was interesting tech, but it never went anywhere. But
Mm.
I've got a lot of time for a company that can make an adaptive controller for people with disabilities to get into gaming.
Yeah, how amazing is that? That's an amazing thing that they did, and a really good thing. They've also, I mean, HoloLive didn't amount to much, I think, but it was certainly an interesting concept, and they were certainly very what they were trying to do with it was very impressive. It may well come back down the track, I guess, but that's another thing. The other thing I think that's worth remembering is that Microsoft was really the one that gave indies their first push onto console via digital distribution. I mean, Sony had the PlayStation Network, but it didn't really kick on until they saw how successful Microsoft was in engaging with indies and making their platform very easy to develop for, very easy to self-publish onto. And now, we get thousands of indie games every week on these consoles. That was really Microsoft that pushed that.
Yeah, well, I was going to get on to the other thing that I think Microsoft really did push, which was that online gaming space, the whole Xbox Live at the time, the idea that they could say, well, we're going to charge you for going online, but we know all the consoles have, well, an Ethernet port at that time. Wi-Fi was the oddity, even into the Xbox 360 generation.
Hmm. Yeah. That was. I remember that being a hugely controversial thing back then, that they were going to charge you just to play online, and people were like, "How dare they?" And we all got over that pretty quickly, I guess. I think the Microsoft also did a good job of adding value to that over time, and making sure that that was a service that people didn't feel uncomfortable paying for, and that's obviously led on to what they're doing these days with Game Pass and the online streaming services and all that kind of stuff. So again, Microsoft really kind of pioneered that stuff, and the other guys have really paid catch up.
Now, I'm someone, as you know, who's kind of very keen on retro gaming, and 20 years means the OG is definitively retro. So it's the 360, arguably, but people get twitchy about that. One of the things that Microsoft actually announced this week, which surprised a lot of people, was that they were reviving, at least temporarily, the whole backwards compatibility push. They announced, I think it's 70 odd titles from the original Xbox, just a couple, and mostly from the 360 to kind of keep them alive, including some big brand names, maybe not everything everyone wanted. What's your view on what Microsoft's done in terms of game preservation? I know that's a subject you're very passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. And Microsoft is by far the company that's done the best job in terms of preserving what they can. It isn't perfect by any means, and it's certainly not comprehensive. I ran the numbers earlier today, and there was something like 2,200 games released on the Xbox 360, of which 560 have been made available via backward compatibility. And I think there's about 150 original Xbox games out of a library of 1,000. So we are talking very small numbers in terms of what Microsoft has been able to preserve, but they did come out and say they've done everything now. This is it. They've preserved everything that they can, putting aside the games that are out of license, or they're just not technically able to make them work on new consoles. So they've done everything they can, and the fact that there is so much other stuff that is now kind of on its way to be lost is more an indictment of the industry as a whole rather than Microsoft themselves. I've always thought that Microsoft has been particularly noble in terms of their willingness to actually do something about this, because the other two certainly don't.
Look, I'm going to hold out some hope, because they did actually say the last time they did their last run of backwards compatibility, right, this is it, we're not doing any more. And clearly, quietly behind the scenes, they were, that at some point, Outrun and Outrun Coast to Coast will actually make it to a new console, because those games are awesome.
I'm still hoping. I mean, it's hope against, but there are doing that. Some of the companies are doing some pretty good things with working out license arrangements with license holders to bring back some of their old classics. I would love to see EA bring back its Lord of the Rings games, which unfortunately it doesn't have license for anymore. Warner Brothers has it, but EA's Lord of the Rings games are always just they were so much better. I'm hoping against hope that something can happen there, because I'd love to play those ones again, especially the real time strategy one. That was an amazing game.
See, this is why I keep old consoles and have lots of dusting to do all of the time. Now, from there, Xbox has become as much a brand as it has a console, and especially with services like Game Pass and cloud streaming. The other day, I was playing Xbox games on a $100 Chromebook, basically just because I could. But I know you've got some fairly strong opinions on Game Pass.
I do, and I'll try not to swear. I can get swearing with it. It's not so much Game Pass itself. It's more an issue I have with the broader streaming services. So all the issues I have with Game Pass, I also have issues with Netflix. I have issues with Spotify, and they all kind of. I guess the main issue is that do affect how stuff gets made in terms of and how it's commercialized and what companies can or artists can do. And my great concern, in particular, with Game Pass is that these systems that have been set up around game subscriptions are really focused on time played. That the longer you play the game, the more money the company gets out of making it. And we already have this issue where game developers and publishers are being incentivized to make these stupidly long games that are much longer than what they deserve to be. And a lot of the more artful games, the 4 or 5, 6 hour long experiences, I just wonder where they're going to have a role in the future with all this streaming stuff that comes through. The other concern I have is what we saw with Netflix. Everyone said Netflix was this great deal when it first came out, because you had a huge library of films to watch for $10 per month or whatever it was. But then Disney came out with theirs, then Stan came out with theirs, then Paramount came out with theirs. And now if you actually want access to the movie that you want to watch, you're probably going to have to subscribe to 7 or 8 different these services. So that $10 a month suddenly becomes $100 a month, which is very expensive. And I think subscription services as a whole, people have forgotten that they were really done by the suits, by the CEOs and CIOs as a way of they're good business, and they're not necessarily good for the consumers. I think that we're going to find that out about Game Pass in the next couple of years. For now, it seems like a good deal. I don't think it's going to be down the track.
See, I get where you're coming from. I don't necessarily agree with you. And I think that rests on, well, both the fact that I think a lot of gamers, honestly, are not as keen on preservation as the two of us are. I certainly like owning my games, and I do understand what you're talking about there as well. But I don't see that market bifurcating the way that streaming video has. The reason that Netflix was able to do what it could do was because nobody was doing it, or it was only being done in very limited ways, so they could get all the rights. Suddenly everyone realized, hey, Netflix is making all the money, and they wanted bits of those. But so far, it's, Sony's sort of got PlayStation now, but it's not really doing what it should.
You do have to remember that these things take a while to really start to have the impact. So Netflix has been around for however many years now. We're only starting to see the negative side of Netflix start to hit home at the moment. But to give you an example, I mean, when Netflix first came out and people like me were expressing concern about ownership of media and all that kind of stuff, people were like, oh, but you can buy the DVDs, they're always going to be around. But trying to find a good DVD player now and trying to find a good DVD purchasing service or a retailer is much harder, and it's going to continue to get harder and harder. And I've seen the numbers in terms of what Xbox is already doing to its physical editions and to its retail partners via the fact that people can now get Game Pass stuff for part of their subscription on day of launch. And there are numbers there that people should be concerned about in terms of what it's going to do long term to the way games are made, sold, and consumed.
The other thing I suppose that Game Pass does is it makes, and cloud streaming as well, is it makes that physical Xbox, that thing that they started with 20 years ago, a lot less relevant. And it struck me while I was doing the research for this segment, Microsoft has released a lot of Xboxes. I mean, way more than there have been announced PlayStations or Nintendo machines. Not just that OG Xbox, but the 360s and Slims and Elites and Xbox S's and Xbox Ones and so much physical hardware. Given that shift towards services, given that shift towards subscriptions, and I share some of your concerns there, but I don't know that market is going to change in the way that you want it to. Do you think that we're nearing the end of the kind of idea of the console, that dedicated box thing?
Yeah, I mean, I remember writing quite a few years ago now about how the next Xbox will be the last one. I got that wrong in that there was another one that has come out, in the Xbox S. But I mean, I thought this strategy has been pretty clear from Microsoft from quite early on, as far as back as the 360, that their end goal would be to turn Xbox into a platform rather than a piece of hardware. And eventually it wouldn't really matter, what device you were using, you're going to be able to have your Xbox experience. I think that is a good thing. I certainly think that if people are able to play top quality games on a $100 Chromebook, then that's a good thing, because that makes games more accessible to a broader range of people. And then all of a sudden, you don't need to have that $700, $800 box sitting on the TV just to be able to play the latest games, especially if Sony and Nintendo also eventually join in with this, and then all of a sudden you don't need to have 1,000 devices, lying around the house, and you'll be able to just play on whatever one device is kind of the hub. I think that's a good thing, and I would love to see that continue to continue to be a trend. I really do think that's a good thing.
1,000 devices sounds very much like my retro gaming shelves, but
I've got no room left under the TV for all the stuff I've got. It's crazy.
It is, but as you say, it is very much all about the games. Thanks so much for your time, Matt. Now is the time for you to face the classic vertical hold 3 questions of doom.
Oh, gosh.
You can answer these in any order you like. I'll just hit you with all 3 at once. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And the controversial question of the moment, what's the best Australian bird?
Right, so you can find me on digitallydownloaded.net, not .com. I don't know where .com goes these days, but it's probably not to the website .net. You can find me on social media at MattSainsB on Twitter, but don't do that. I have opinions on there that most people don't find pleasant. And you know that well, Alex. And in terms of my favourite bird, definitely the cockatoo. They destroy everything they touch, but they're pretty damn cute about it as they do it. I've got cockatoos that are hanging around my home, and I made the mistake of feeding them sunflower seeds once, and they've never gone since. They just rip up everything that they get in touch with. But they are very cute. I do like them.
That's 2 weeks in a row for the cockatoo. Thanks so much for your time, Matt.
Thank you very much.
So, amidst a very busy week of tech news, Apple decided to get into the headlines in a rather unexpected way, announcing that consumers from next year will be able to buy parts and access service repair manuals for iPhones and Macs. We're joined by Choice's Erin Turner to discuss this. And Erin, we had you on the show a little while ago to discuss right to repair. This falls under that umbrella. How significant is this?
Look, it is good news, but like a lot of announcements, it's a big headline and there's no detail. So we don't know when Australia is getting it. We don't know specifically what parts, what issues. And I really want to know, how is it going to interact with the consumer law? That's not clear to me yet.
So I put some of these questions to Apple myself earlier, writing this stuff up, and got the almost default response of, we have no information to share at this time, or words to that effect. And the warranty thing was exactly what I thought about, because as soon as you say to people, right, well, you can fix it yourself, what does that mean when or if you break it yourself? And to what degree are you breaking it yourself versus, was it the part that they gave you or the instructions that they gave you?
Exactly. Well, it's also at what point should Apple give you a refund or a replacement phone versus you doing your own repair? All of these issues will interact with the consumer law. And I'd be worried about any situation where Apple leans on people to do more of their own repairs rather than takes responsibility themselves. But this is me hunting around in the detail. Overall, I'd say this is unexpected good news.
I'm right in assuming that Apple can't say you can repair it yourself, but as soon as you crack it open yourself, you've voided the warranty. Then they're not allowed to do stuff like that anymore, are they?
Well, it's actually an interesting thing that's being explored in the right to repair inquiry, that it's officially done, but we haven't seen it. The government's sitting on it, and I hope it's released really soon. But as part of that big inquiry process, they looked at warranty void terms. Crack it open, it's all on you from there. The Productivity Commission suggested that it could be unlawful or an unfair contract term, but they wanted to go further and potentially recommend law reform just to ban that completely. So it's still a little bit of a grey zone in Australia about whether companies like Apple or others could. I'd say they couldn't, but untested.
I guess it does get complicated when you're talking about something like a screen repair, for example. I think if you open it up and the screen that Apple sends you still doesn't work, yeah, I think that's pretty cut and dried. If you open it up and in doing so you run your screwdriver along the bit that does the water resistance, that might be on you, though.
It's hard to know, isn't it? A lot of big companies, sometimes including Apple, have run the line that we can't let more independent repairers do their work or even individuals do repairs because they'll ruin the product or because there's big safety issues. And I think what this announcement shows is like, well, there's probably not big safety issues. And if Apple's smart, they can get around the incidental damage stuff. They should just be providing good instructions so you don't accidentally drive your screwdriver through the middle. And they should be designing products that are easy to, click open, operate, so you're not accidentally going to do something wrong.
But that's the thing.
It'll be interesting to see how they cope with that.
Because they try and make things so super thin, they're almost impossible to open, and they have a lot of non-replaceable parts. And the same with the new MacBooks that, like, you can't even swap out the hard drive yourself. I think it would be a pretty brave person who wasn't already some kind of repairer who actually tried to crack open something like an iPhone and had a go at it themselves. I did notice that they offer genuine parts and tools. So do you think you'll need to use Apple's $50 screwdriver so you don't void your warranty?
It's quite possible they'll require that. I'd expect in Australia, what I'd hope this leads to is more independent repair shops taking up these parts and tools. Rather than necessarily, there might be some individuals who are really interested and feel capable doing it themselves. But one of the big things we keep hearing from Australians is that particularly in regional and remote areas, there's no one who they can go to easily to get something fixed. So having one person in a town or a region that can do it, that would solve a lot of problems here. whether that's how it all rolls out and works, and whether Apple charges $50 or $500 for their fancy proprietary screwdriver, we will see.
See, I think the screwdriver is arguably less of an issue because there's such a huge third-party repair ecosystem out there, and you've got sites like iFixit, which have been pulling these things apart and selling tools for years and years and years. I can't exactly see how Apple's going to pick that you haven't used the $50 screwdriver. What I think is a little bit more interesting there, and maybe really good news for the third-party repair places, is Apple's not just doing parts, they're not just doing tools. The first step, they say, is you're going to look in a repair manual. So they're actually opening up the curtains. They're actually saying, here's how we repair stuff, which for a third-party repairer, even if you're going to be using a third-party part, maybe not an Apple one, that's good news, isn't it?
Oh, it's huge. And it's exactly the kind of responsible step we hope more companies take. That was the bit that surprised me, because there have been big tech companies that have really fought back, like some big laptop companies directly taking action against individuals in Australia for publishing repair guides, like trying to use copyright law to stamp that out. So this is the opposite. It's really proactive. It's wonderful. I don't know where it's come from. That's the surprise from Apple.
I thought that was part of the push, though, because I know, especially in the US, there's been a big push for right to repair laws, and I would assume probably the EU as well, because they tend to be pretty forward-looking in that. But I always thought that tied into that was that you must actually include the manuals on how to do it. So you're saying that hasn't necessarily always been the case. You can have the right to repair, but you don't, not the right to know what the hell you're doing.
Look, so right to repair, I feel like I've been buried in this for about a year and a half.
Which is why you're on the podcast, because you know it better than anybody.
I've gone deep nerd on this. It's interesting. Right to repair in the US is being used to describe things like my individual right to crack something open and I need a manual. Right to repair in the EU is actually much more advanced, and it's much more about the circular economy and are there good systems and processes to find a sustainable product and then deal with it at its end of life, not necessarily as an individual, but collectively. It very much reflects two different political ideologies, I think. So I'm personally much more interested in Australia. I think the EU approach is going to lead to better environmental and consumer outcomes. I want people to be able to get, repair manuals and be able to do things themselves, but it will still only be a small group of Australians. Really what we need when we talk about right to repair is a much bigger systems approach to help people buy stuff that will last and get fixes where the business takes responsibility rather than pushing it down too much on an individual.
Apple hasn't, as you said earlier, Apple hasn't actually said how much parts are going to cost, and they've been a little bit specific in saying this is iPhone 12 and 13 only and then the M1 Max. So if you've got older Apple stuff, you're probably out of luck, but that's guesswork. What's interesting, though, is if you look at their prices currently for things like screen repairs, and they've said screen repairs are a common thing. This is something we're going to address here. Like the cheapest iPhone 12 mini screen repair, because that's the smallest iPhone, cheapest screen, out of warranty is like $359.
You buy a whole phone for that.
Well, you can't buy an iPhone, to be fair. You can't buy an iPhone. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how much of that is labor. How much will Apple charge you? Will they charge you $300 for a screen and say, oh, yeah, the labor's $50? Or will they charge you $200 for a screen? Is there a margin, and is there a position where Apple's actually just doing this because, hey, they can make a lot of profit out of parts?
Oh, that's a really interesting one. But look, I don't know. It'll come down to what they end up pricing it for. But my read on this is that kind of similar to the privacy announcements they made last year around app tracking. This seems to be a play for them to be that premium eco-conscious brand. So I think they've probably thought about it as how do we look different to our competitors? Whether it works or not is going to be a completely different thing.
Okay, well, it'll be really interesting to see when Apple formally says we can get this in Australia and how much it'll cost and what it means for the warranty. But thank you so much for making time for the show this week, Erin.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And you've been on the show before. You know it is now time to face the vertical hold 3 questions of doom. And you've already answered the current topical one, so I have to come up with a new one on the fly.
Greatest Doctor Who villain. Greatest Doctor Who villain.
It's always Daleks, isn't it? That's easy.
In any order you like, where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And dogs or cats?
Ooh.
So choice.com.au. You can find me on Twitter, Erin L. Turner, and I love both, but I live with cats. So I think for my own safety, I have to say cats.
A wise choice, I think, although I suspect Adam would disagree.
So, Chris, as if Telstra wasn't tangled up enough in our lives, is now they want to sell us electricity? What's the story here?
Yeah, well, Telstra would argue that they've been playing around with electricity for quite a while. It's actually, you think about this in the Telstra terms, kind of almost as a freebie. So think about the sort of batteries and the generators and stuff that Telstra has to put out for its telco infrastructure generally, right?
Yeah.
Like they've spent the last year after the bushfires, for instance, boosting batteries in at mobile towers and all sorts of stuff. Well, they've got that sort of stuff in exchanges as well. And Telstra has decided, and they've been signaling this for a couple of years, but they've decided that they want to enter the energy game because they've got these power assets that just sit there. They've paid for them previously, and they decide that they can make a bit of money out of them. So there was a Queensland power station that had a fire in one of its turbine halls last year. Telstra said they kept the equivalent of about 50,000 homes on the grid when that incident happened. And they said they've kind of had these deals with enterprises and other stuff before, but they're wanting to take it to the wider market by the end of this fiscal year, which is mid next year. And so what they want to do is they want to sort of actually bundle it into the My Telstra app. And the way that they're going to sell it to you is that because it's all battery based and Telstra is now all carbon neutral, that this is a power supplier that is totally carbon abated. And anything that they can't get from the projects they're involved in, I get the sense that they'll just buy it off one of the regular resellers and then they'll go get some credits elsewhere.
So this is not at all what I pictured. I thought this was just someone else white labeling power as a retailer who didn't own any like Kogan or Woolworths or whoever. But they've actually got some infrastructure and some skin in the game here. So do I just switch from whichever power company I'm with now to Telstra, or is it more complicated than that?
No, I imagine that would be the process. The same process we do for power retailers at the moment. Telstra pointed out that basically people think about this, that had some numbers, like about 6 minutes a year. But basically, I mean, you think about this when you move, basically.
Yeah.
And probably when you get a bit of bill shock every month or quarter, whenever it is. And so they were like, well, people call us to move. So when they do that, why don't we just bundle in with them
power at the same
time? And so they tried, they did a test. They were reselling a third-party product. Didn't say what it was, but basically someone was calling up to move, and in the middle of it, the person in the call center said, do you want to get some power from Telstra, or however they pitched it? And they said that, customers were quite warm to it. And I imagine that is going to be exactly how they take it to market. They said they're going to do this very slowly because they acknowledge that when the internet goes down, it's not great. But when your power goes down, it's really not great. So they want to make sure they don't overload the system. And so they're starting with their own employees, and then they're going to hit the market in about 7 months' time by the sounds of it.
Just to clarify, the power, this is no different to signing up from anyone else. It's not like your power will stay on when your neighbour's power goes off because you're using some separate power generation. No. It's just normal power.
Yeah. But it just happens that Telstra has its own renewable sources that they have for their own corporate carbon abatement reasons that they can leverage. Right? So the reason why Telstra thinks they can sell that they can have a cheaper cost to market than all the other competitors is because they've already got batteries, solar farms, they've already bought wind power from the generators. Telstra isn't going to get into generation per se, but they are going to buy it from renewable generators. So they want to go in there because they've got the assets, and also they can label it as completely green energy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when we talk about the white labeling stuff, though, because energy, people often get this wrong. Energy, as you get it, as it comes into your home, the wire that comes into your home, typically, and this is very weird because it's so different state by state, but the wire that goes into your home is typically actually owned by a completely separate company to the one you pay your energy bill to. They're a kind of middleman. Telstra's stepping into that middleman position, though. You're not going to get a Telstra tech coming out when a tree comes crashing down through your power lines, are you?
No, you're not going to get the Telstra tech coming. It's still going to be owned by that energy distributor, right? That's still going to hold your wire, but you're going to get your bills from Telstra. It's the same way. Yeah, if you switch to one of the other retailers, then it's the same thing now. And the other thing I think I probably need to add in here and why Telstra thinks they can do so well is that, okay, Telstra does not have the best reputation in this country. I think we can all agree on that. But one of the rare sectors that has a worse reputation, and I'm looking at my power company right now, are other power companies.
And that's when Chris's power got cut off.
Good thing I'm on the laptop. I'm going to stick it to the man. But, but they think they can come in here. This isn't the Sol Trujillo Telstra trying to get into power. This is the Andy Penn, we might stuff up once, but the second time we'll get it right, Telstra. So they think that they can bring, a better experience to this. And then suddenly other things that they've been doing, like onshoring all their call center staff, suddenly start to make a lot more sense. And
this is limited states, though, as well, at least for this launch period as well. That's regulatory as well, I'd imagine.
Yeah, well, yeah, obviously, yeah. I think like WA is, it really, it literally is its own grid. It does its own thing. So they're targeting, and when I say they're going to ramp up slowly, by 2025, they only want 5% of the East Coast market. And one of the analysts that was in on the Investor Day this week, they mentioned that that's pretty much only like several tens of thousands, if that. So it's not like they're expecting to have millions of people on their grid straight up.
But this is a part of a bigger trend in the utilities market. And Alex, you would have seen this for some of the people that you write for. All the utility providers are trying to cut each other's lunch because they realize if you ring up because you want electricity or you want gas or you want internet, you probably want the other things as well. So let's try and pinch a few customers.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you've got the likes of AGL, for example, who sort of do the reverse thing. They bought, Southern Phone, I think, if I remember correctly. And they now do their own broadband as well. And I think Telstra had some stuff to say about energy providers coming into the telco space as well, didn't they, Chris?
Yeah. They said that they would rather come from telco into the power sector because in power, an electron is an electron. That is genuinely it. People try and tell you, buy green power. The fact of the matter is once it hits the grid, it's an electron. It don't matter where it came from.
No NextG electrons? No 5G Telstra electrons?
I'm sorry to say, people, coal-powered electrons are not grey-coloured and wind-powered ones aren't necessarily green. I'm sorry. But because electricity is electricity, there's not really... The chance to differentiate is on the customer side, on the portal, on the service, and they're like, we can play that game. Whereas AGL has to come in and then they have to strike a deal with one of Telstra, Optus, Vodafone. And in that market, you are playing, if AGL signs up and tries to sell mobile services through Vodafone, then we all know Telstra's just going to go, ha, 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 we're in more of the country you are. So that's why they would rather be going into the much more neutral market than coming out into the more differentiated phone market.
But what's Telstra offering in terms of peak evening voltage?
We don't know yet. We don't know yet.
And so, classically, Telstra's done this kind of bundled play before. Back when people particularly cared about landlines, you could do, landline and mobile or landline and mobile and Foxtel and get discounts and so on. Is this something where they're signaling we're going to do it cheaper? Or is it just hey, this is really super convenient. Come under the Telstra warming umbrella of green warmth?
Look, I think initially they'll go cheaper, but their actual long-term play is to turn their smart modem into the smart hub, right? Because they will want that to be able to then go, well, we've got smarts in it that work out that when certain things should be turned on and all this sort of stuff. So that's how I think they're trying to sell it into the bigger Telstra organization for why you want to be in here. Other than the fact that, well, you've already paid for this infrastructure, let's make some money out of it for a change rather than it just being a sinkhole.
Because I know the power providers, some of them are looking into smart home stuff as well, and they want to sell you energy monitors and turning your lights on and off and all that kind of stuff. So there's a few different, it's like they're converging from different angles onto the same center point, and it's who gets there first and who owns the customer.
Yeah, or who does it best.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, this raises the other technical tricky point, and I don't know if Telstra said anything about this at all, which is that whole smart meters thing. Because people in some older properties may be sitting on older actual energy meters. People in newer ones with smart meters, you've generally, not always, because it does, as I said before, it gets super complicated state by state. but generally have a slightly wider range of power providers because some of them only want to work with smart meters. Has Telstra said anything about that? Whether or not, if I've got an old 1940s era set of fuses still ticking along on my holiday home, will I be able to get some Telstra electrons into that thing?
Look, they didn't go into that depth of it, but they did say that they wanted to have real-time monitoring and all that sort of stuff in the Telstra app. So I mean, obviously that can only occur on a smart meter. But I mean, we just have to wait and see what happens on that. To be honest, there's not they're doing everything and nothing at this point. It's 7 months away.
So why announce it now? I mean, this was the other thing that I thought was curious. They've said, I think they're trialing it with like Telstra staff now, and then New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia by end of fiscal 2022. But why announce it in November if I can't buy a Telstra Electron till June next year?
Well, I think because they just got their authorization to do this. And remember, and this was an investor day. This wasn't a consumer day. So This is for the people that are buying stock or for the market analysts to, up the rating or what have you. So, and they have been making noises about this. So, I've been writing about it now for, I think, almost a year or so. So, I mean, or maybe even two. But, so it's just creeping towards where it is and sort of shows where they are in that process.
Well, speaking of kind of investors and shareholders and the like, Google earlier in the week announced they're making what seems like a pretty big investment in Australia. Is Google just offshoring $1 billion for tax purposes, Chris, or are we getting something out of this deal?
God, if they were going to do that, they should have done it 10 years ago before all the international tax laws got harmonized. I don't think if you were going to try and, ferret $1 billion away as a Cayman Island-based company already, I'd have left it back in the islands. Or maybe it's Bermuda. I mean, does it really matter? They're in the Caribbean somewhere.
So what are they doing with this $1 billion?
What they're doing is they're doing a research hub. They said they're going to hire, there's going to be 6,500 direct jobs. Now, I don't think they broke down how much of that was actually their workforce versus construction jobs versus what have you, but 6,500 direct jobs is pretty good. And then they run off with that, as they all do, and make a number like 28,000 jobs. But what it works out to is $200 million for 5 years, each year for 5 years. For things like quantum research, AI research, the kind of stuff that Australia actually does. The big problem with Google, of course, is that they will do something for 2 years and then decide they don't want to do it.
Google read it, cough, cough.
Yeah, have we forgotten that one? No, we haven't. Have we forgotten Inbox? No, we haven't.
Wave.
Well,
rest in peace.
Maybe best left forgotten.
Some things are best taken behind the shed. But yeah, so in Google terms, you say it's 5 years. Like, that's actually a pretty large commitment for Google because they get bored very easily. And, there's also that whole play, they had the Prime Minister there and what have you, and people played this up as, Google's, making good after threatening to pull out before. And it's like, you don't pull up $1 billion deal just like clicking your fingers, So they've clearly been working on this a bit in the background. And like I say, they're doing the bits that Australia's good at. So why not do it?
How much of this, though? I mean, I found it interesting because Google always whenever Google talks about Australia, they always lean on Google Maps because it was developed here. It's like the CSIRO always leaning on Wi-Fi because it was developed here.
They developed how to multiplex it properly.
Well, yeah, okay.
Don't let Larry Marshall ever tell you any different.
The foundational tech was there, but how much of this is going to end up as actual Google R&D? How much are we going to develop quantum computing? I think they're doing that with Macquarie Uni. How much is Macquarie Uni going to develop quantum computing only to discover it's now Google Quantum TM?
Well, that's the beauty of co-investment, isn't it? The important bit, I think, for the university is not so much that it's Google Quantum. It's more how much of the royalty check do you get from Google Quantum? That's the big thing for the university side of the fact.
Actual money, yes.
Yeah,
they're a bit lacking in that of late.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also interesting that out of all the unis in Australia that are doing it, I wouldn't necessarily have picked Macquarie. If you present them to me, I'd have gone with UNSW, for instance.
That's who I was going to say. They're doing a lot in quantum.
Yeah, and USyd have their little quantum shop down the road from me as well. And so Macquarie's kind of, they're not really up as they're not really up there with those two old universities.
But
So
there's an ice rink over the road, so they can like super cool the quantum computers. Yeah.
Well, it's always good to see the Sydney Bears at lunchtime, I guess. But that stood out to me as okay, interesting, mate. Because Google has been doing their own quantum thing for their own for the while. They've got the annealers under the brand name that has escaped me. But one of the OG quantum brand, D-Link's a router, D-Wave. Yeah, D-Wave or whatever they're called. They've been doing quantum annealing, which isn't quantum computers at all, but it's in the same thing. So, maybe Google are bringing their own things onto Macquarie, to which Macquarie would probably be like, yeah, cool, we can work with that. Allows us to promote ourselves, especially overseas, now that international students are going to get back shortly, that, we're a leading uni in quantum.
Speaking of grand plans that may or may not go as planned, Labor has their new NBN plan. What is it that they propose they do should they manage to oust ScoMo at the next election?
So Labor wants to spend $2.4 billion basically extending the fibre to the node upgrade system that NBN is already doing to a further 1.5 million premises. So when they do that, they're obviously going to hit out of suburbia, and they're also going to take it out to regional areas, and they said there's going to be about 660,000 or so regional homes will get access to this that they wouldn't have got under the current plan.
But aren't they gradually extending that anyway? They keep making announcements that they've added a bit more. So even if Labor doesn't get in, might this eventually happen anyway?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
So it's not just my imagination, all right?
No. There are pockets of technology where NBN, for their own commercial and confidence reasons that we've raked over before, but they would do this in stages, right?
Yeah.
So the big one being fibre to the basement. There's still a big question mark over what you do with that under either plan, under the coalition plan or the Labor plan. And it's likely too that once they hit that 75% that they planned by 2023, that they will turn around and go, okay, well, we've worked it out, it's economical now to do it to whatever the percentage is. The interesting bit with the Labor plan is that they said that they committed to keeping NBN in public hands, at least for their first term, at least. Definitely, that's in concrete. And that's because they're like, oh, we want to make sure that there's not a digital divide, read into that they maybe looking to spend even more down the road to bring other people online. The big thing is how much will they send fixed node into the fixed wireless footprint? Because the fixed wireless is more or less cooked. So you've got to get people
off it.
Get people better technology in there. Yeah. So I mean, if you're running a fiber link to the bottom of a fixed wireless tower, why aren't you also just running that fiber link into town and just giving people proper NBN in the first place? There's the question. So what Labor's done here is maybe they've just spelled out where the roadmap was going, probably accelerated it a bit, but also said that by keeping it in public hands, it does raise the potential for NBN to not have to make the sort of returns that they would under the current government and stuff. Maybe they might be okay with as long as NBN breaks even, they'll be fine. Whereas the current government wants NBN to make commercial returns so that they can sell it off.
But wasn't even the original plan for NBN to be sold off? Wasn't even Labor's original plan? So this is a real change in direction.
They said they're going to hold it in public hands for as long as it's in the public interest to do so.
Ah, that's a nice wishy-washy statement.
It's a pause, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's basically saying it's not going to be in the public interest for 3 years, maybe 6, right? But after that, well, I mean, the public interest at that point would be what's in the Labor government's interest. What does a third-term elbow look like? I don't know. I don't even know what a first-term elbow looks like, but
Do you think the coalition would want to offload it as soon as possible, or will they also hang on to it for a bit longer as well until the numbers add up?
They would be looking at that balance sheet. Every time NBN reports results, they're looking at it going, is this the EBITDA multiple we need to flog this thing yet? And they do realise as well that it's not yet and it's not for a while as well. Even the coalition have said, we're not going to be getting rid of it in the next 5 years or so. You need the financials to work their way through. But, people... it turns out people trust Labor governments a little bit more, despite what happened in the 80s, not to flog stuff off.
Funny that. Although I suppose also pausing it does mean that if you've got an NBN which has a larger fibre base, it's presumably also worth a bit more.
It's worth a bit more, and it also takes longer to pay off, right? Which is why you want to hold it in public hands. You want to give them the runway to say, go for it. If this thing pays off in X many years, well, we've got you still in the nest. Go do it. Whereas when NBN is looking at stuff at the moment, they would have some idea of when they believe that they're going to be sold off, whether it's 2030, 2035, 2040. And they would be doing the accounting to that. By holding it in public hands, you're able to say, well, you don't have to squeeze people so much.
Going back to what you were saying about keeping it in government hands longer to change the pressure on them to make a profit and change the economics, without wanting to start some shit, isn't that what they should have done in the first place?
Yes, but see, the problem is when you're going into coming out of a global financial crisis, is you don't drop $50 billion on the budget.
Yeah.
And that's always been the problem with this thing, is that Wayne Swan and Kevin Rudd never had the intestinal fortitude to put that thing on the budget. If they did, a lot of the crap that we've had to deal with in the preceding decade, it wouldn't have arisen. You wouldn't have had the commercial returns stuff. You just don't have the sort of pressure that's on NBN to make money at the moment. I mean,
so CVC would maybe go away.
And I was about to get to it. The big one that is CVC. CVC is a direct result of NBN having to make money. If they didn't have to make money, they could just charge an access fee because it doesn't cost them much to move packets around. It shouldn't anyway. They'll tell you it does, but it shouldn't. You could just charge it AVC and we'd all be, like New Zealand, off to the races.
So basically the NBN should have been submarines.
Whoa, hang on. Do you remember, what was it? Was Minitel? Was that the really old French network? Did we?
Oh, wow.
Is that what you're suggesting we should have bought in 2009? Well, I mean, that analogy has layers, mate.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Chris for joining us for this week's show.
Always good to be here with an unbroken broadband connection.
Excellent to hear. And you're a regular guest. You know what you're about to get hit with, sort of. The Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. And you've answered most of them over the past few months, it turns out. So, where can people find your work online? Where can they find your social media online? And because we're going contentious this week, dogs or cats?
Dogs. Absolutely dogs every day of the week.
Solid.
Yeah. You can find me at zdnet.com. And then you can just track me down through there. If you want to track me on Twitter, you hit the little bird above my articles. It'll actually tell you my handle, and then you'll find out what I live as online.
And also, thanks again to Matt and Erin for making time for the show. And as always, you can catch us online at VerticalHoldAU on Twitter, via the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks everyone for tuning in. It's great to see some new listeners coming along recently. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice, and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.